You're all very welcome. We have spoken so far about a lot of very complex and sometimes, for somebody like me, scary matters in relation to the technicalities of buildings and how things have gone wrong and so on and so forth. But this session today is very much more in my comfort zone as a psychologist, and it's about the human costs of the issues that have arisen as a result of pyrite. So our first speaker today is Dr. Lorcan Byrne, and Lorcan is a colleague of my own. He is a sociologist. He teaches in Toulouse. He has been teaching and researching for about 25 years in the area of homelessness. And he teaches on the social care and community development programs. He's also chair of the Midwest Simon Community Subcommittee on Policy, Staff Training and Policy, which is a bit of a mouthful. But so he's working very actively in dealing with issues of homelessness and what it's like for people to be unable to have a home. He's going to look at the impact of housing insecurity on people's health and well-being, and he's going to be looking at issues relating to sociology and epidemiology and some empirical evidence that you can use in your future advocacy. So with all that in mind, can I hand over to Dr. Byrne?
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks very much. Can I get a thumbs up that you can hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be here. I'm sorry I can only be here for today's afternoon session in this panel. I'm certainly looking forward to hear what the other participants have to say. And I suppose I should start off by really kind of expressing my solidarity, because as far as I'm aware, most of the people here are being impacted by this situation with the pyrite and the concrete blocks, so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, what an incredibly insecure situation it must be. And since Lisa and Martina kind of flagged to me, you know, this conference was happening, I've been thinking quite a bit about it. And at the very beginning, when Lisa spoke to me about the situation and you and your group and this conference, so on and so forth, began to think about, you know, something that might be comparable. Was probably Priory Hall in Dublin. And I know you've been talking a lot about building standards, probably, and legal stuff. I was certainly looking at the your conference program, and I won't be going into that terrain. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that you actually share a lot of things in common with a lot of other people, and it probably opens up other avenues of literature that perhaps I think could be useful to you. Certainly in terms of, I mean, I know you've got a big body of work to come up in terms of advocating for yourselves and your situation and what could happen in terms of officialdom and help you might receive from the government, something that might be on a part to what's happened in Donegal. So look, I'll just plow on, because I know I've only got 15 minutes and I have about 20 slides, and I'll try not to rush them and explain them as best I can. But just to say, I suppose, Lisa's a psychologist. I'm a sociologist by training and by profession, and very involved with things like housing and homelessness, as Lisa said, for quite a long period of time. What we tend to do in psychology, it's a kind of diagnostic discipline, you know, in that we try to analyze the particularities of situations that occur for various groups within society. And I think that there are other groups that are comparable to you in terms of what they've experienced. And I suppose I really want to draw on kind of health and well-being and the literature that's out there for people who are, I think, in situations that are comparable to yours. So sorry now, this is a bit blurry, but I just took a photograph of this book I have here. It's called The Irish Welfare State in the 21st Century by Mary Murphy and Fiona Duclos. They're kind of politics and social policy experts. And this is from a chapter in there that I think you might find useful, or certainly parts of it. It's by Joe Finnerty, Cathal O'Connell, and Siobhan O'Sullivan, who are three of, I suppose, amongst the experts on housing in Ireland. It's a small group of us. But housing is a fundamental human need, addressing the unavoidable necessity for shelter and the basic requirement for a home. In addition to physical security, housing also contributes to psychological well-being by fulfilling a sense of personal space, autonomy, and privacy. Housing, along with other basic needs such as health, education, and income, is essential for a minimum quality of life. And I'm very sensitive to the needs of this group in terms of, literally your house is crumbling, and how that is going to impact upon your health and well-being. And I will speak to that further in a moment. An issue that's come up at the moment is the insertion of the right to housing, and the Committee for Economic and Social and Cultural Rights at the United Nations recognizes the rights to adequate housing as being of central importance for the enjoyment of all economic, social and cultural rights. And in general, comment 4 from the committee, it states that the right to housing should not be interpreted in a narrow or restrictive sense, in which equates to, for example, the shelter provided merely by having a roof over one's head, or views shelter exclusively as a commodity. Rather, it should be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, in peace, and in dignity. And the issue of housing, also appeared all the way back in 1948, the UNCRC, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which saw housing as a fundamental human right. So there is a kind of a rights issue there as well, and certainly that's something that's under issue. I'm drawing here from some work from Maynooth. There's a really good research institute in Maynooth called the National Institute for Regional Spatial Analysis. Some fantastic people are there and have been through there, including Rob Kitchen, he's a social geographer, and Rory Hearn, who's a sociologist. And I'm just kind of paraphrasing some of what they say in their work, and I have a link here, and this is all being recorded, but I can share my slides with you guys. But housing can be an incredibly emotive issue. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. Shelter and a sense of home is essential for our well-being, which is why the right to housing is enshrined in the conventions of the UN and ratified by many national governments, and it's even on the legislative agenda in Ireland at the moment. So housing provides us with a sanctuary, a sense of identity and belonging, a firm base from which to venture out into the wider world. A few other points from their work: losing one's home and housing insecurity is highly distressing. And living in substandard housing or even being homeless can be detrimental to one's mental and physical well-being. And I'll speak to that and provide you with some evidence on that in a moment. So housing is also seen as an asset. It's one of the most expensive purchases most families will make across their lives. It has a use value. It's a form of shelter. It also has an asset value. It has exchange value. And as a way that has developed within Irish society as often our primary or most significant investment, it's a way in which we pass our wealth onto the next generation. So when something happens to make your home owned insecure, the effects are very real, and I have no doubt are felt in a very real way. Are you in a unique situation? Yes and no. I mean, the particularities of your situation are very unique, and looking at what's happened in Donegal, I hope you have a similar or even better outcome in terms of that. However, the experience of housing insecurity is shared by many other groups. And while I haven't met many of you, I did speak with Martina very briefly over the telephone. And so I haven't spoken to any of you, but I have been taking time to try to empathize, to try to imagine what it must be like for you to be in an experience where the concrete blocks that are designed to hold up your home are no longer structurally sound. So who are the other people that I think are in a similar situation to yourself? Well, I would say it's those who are on an eviction notice. While their homes are not physically crumbling around them, their ability to remain within that home is certainly being undermined. Those who are in mortgage arrears, and wearing my other cap where I work with Midwest Simon, we have had, especially back in the early 2010, 2012, 13, 14, with a lot of people whose homes were repossessed and came into it, people whose rent in arrears and people who are living in substandard accommodation. But what all of these people have in common, I think, perhaps, and you have in common too, is a sense of that security of the home is being eroded in some sense. And there, if we were to think that there are very strong social, structural commonalities between you and many of these groups, well, then it opens up a huge range of literature that we can draw from, that you can use to understand your situation, but more importantly, of course, to advocate for some changes. So in terms of learning from our experience of working with the Midwest Simon community for the last 3 years or so, I also work for Respond Housing Association. Many of our clients, and including families with children, are falling into homeless services, have spent a significant amount of time in housing insecurity, just like the 4 categories I named earlier. And many clients are coming from middle-class backgrounds. Current housing crisis impacts those regardless of their social class. So when homeless services back, before the current financial crisis would have predominantly come from, working class, disadvantaged communities. But now there's a significant proportion of families who are coming from, I'd imagine, kind of financially secure kind of backgrounds, or backgrounds that had once been financially secure, but are no longer the case. So while I'm not suggesting that any of the families involved in this pirate situation are bound for homeless services, not at all. But there are similarities in terms of how housing insecurity with our other clients, and how this opens up a broader literature that we can draw upon to highlight how these are comparable situations, and in particular how they can impact upon your health and well-being. So I've done a little bit of a literature review, and I just highlighted and filtered some of the stuff that I thought might be most useful. So this is a piece from a couple of years ago, just in 2019, Housing Insecurity, Mental Health in Wales. And there's emerging evidence that, so I'm quoting here from the report, emerging evidence that people who are unable to achieve their housing goals feel frustrated, disappointed, failure, anxiety, and stress. Well, that's kind of no surprise there, Sherlock. But it is perhaps unsurprising that evictions and foreclosures have been shown to have an adverse effect on mental health. Research in Sweden found that individuals facing eviction were 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than the rest of the population at large. However, it's not just the loss of housing that relates to mental ill health, also a wider sense of insecurity, that the potential to be asked to leave one's home. For those living in private rental sector, insecurity of tenure has been shown to hinder individuals' abilities to feel shelter. And when we go on a little bit later, you might just give me an indication of how long I've taken so far. Am I doing okay for time, Lisa? Yeah, okay. You give me a 5-minute warning, will you? Just because there's a few important pieces here I want to include. This is a report from this year, and it's the effects of housing insecurity on children's health. We've really become concerned with children's health and well-being, particularly since we sent up a family hub. And you might say, oh yeah, but that's the particularities of homeless services. But remember, so many of our clients, homelessness happens. Yeah, it happens overnight. You're evicted and you're out, but you're aware that it might be coming for a very long period of time, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes longer, and we've had a lot of children who are coming into family hubs, and quite often what we're trying to do is respond to their needs, but a lot of their needs kind of emerged in that period of housing insecurity before they even came into the service. Now, homelessness itself is an incredibly traumatic experience for families and for children, but the fear of homelessness also has a huge knock-on effect. So people, there's a kind of a stigma out there that, well, homelessness is caused by mental ill health and addiction. And of course, there is a high correlation there that mental illness can cause homelessness, but the threat of homelessness also, all of us might have a propensity towards illness, but being in this situation is going to heighten that experience for many of us and bring on that potential, you might say, to the surface. And the impacts on children is quite significant, actually. So there's a well-established connection between housing conditions and children's health. However, little is known on how housing insecurity indicators, including multiple moves, being behind on rent mortgage, doubling up on crowding, how this affects children's health and well-being. And it's not just the standard of physical infrastructure. It's not just like exposure to, damp conditions or something like that. Rather, the child's sense of security, the sense of identity and belonging. And it's not just an Irish thing, but it is like kind of, what is the first thing you say in our society when you meet a stranger? Where are you from? Where do you live? Who are your people? What's going on? Your home, your community. These are things that are absolutely fundamental to your sense of self, and from that, your health and your well-being. Results from this review provide important information on the importance of certain housing and security indicators for children's health. Although housing is increasingly recognized as a social determinant of health, It may be particularly important to go beyond the physical housing conditions to consider and measure housing insecurity in future work as a key social determinant in shaping health in pediatric populations. Okay, the last piece I want to do here in terms of empirical evidence is from a report that was done back in New York. It was actually done over 10 years ago, but it's focused on newly made homeless people in the New York homeless services system. And they found that 6% had diabetes, 17% had hypertension, 17% had asthma, 35% had had major depression, and 53% had substance use disorders, indicating that chronic disease is more common amongst people who are living in housing insecurity. People who are homeless also have an increased risk of premature death. Okay, so what experiences then have we learned from Simon community, so on and so forth? Well, the fear of becoming homelessness can result in ill health or exacerbate existing health conditions. Yeah, is someone trying to come in? Sorry, no, it's a funny acoustic I was hearing there, sorry. So other characteristics of people in the situation, there's high levels of mental illness, and that's from parents and children. Physical illness, and I'm going to jump ahead to the next slide. Sorry, I didn't organize this very well, but I just got this from the Mayo Clinic. And I mean, I think we can all agree that housing insecurity increases the level of stress that we're under. What does stress do to us? Well, in terms of your body, more headaches, muscle tension and pain, chest pain, fatigue, change in sex drive, stomach upset, sleeping problems. How does it affect your mood? Anxiety, restlessness, lack of motivation or focus, feeling overwhelmed, irritability or anger, sadness or depression. And in terms of behaviors, overeating, undereating, angry outbursts, drug and alcohol misuse, tobacco use, social withdrawal, and exercising less often. So if we just go back to this original one, what we're also seeing with the people who are coming in contact with our service, and I know this is anecdotal evidence, but I know that it is very true, we're seeing much higher levels of family breakup. You know, the stress, actually my grandmother knew this to be true. She wasn't a social theorist, but she had loads of brilliant sayings. She said, like, when trouble comes knocking at the door, love jumps out the window, which is a saying, and it really fits into these kind of frameworks, you know, in terms of understanding what's going on here. Higher levels of family breakup, higher levels of domestic violence, higher than average levels of substance misuse, including smoking tobacco, children missing developmental milestones. And one of the things I wanted to say to you, which comes up, and I know this is anecdotally, but like, what are the major sources of stress for many of our clients is dealing with officialdom, you know, dealing with local authorities, dealing with politicians, and a sense of not being heard, not being listened to, and how this can completely ramp up the levels of stress, so on and so forth. Okay. So how can we explain these links? Well, I mean, we could go into some really advanced theory, but I think even, you know, Maslow is probably taught on now, and every single program out there related to humanities type subject management or something like that. I know he's a bit basic, but at the same time, he does identify something that's fundamental. Like, he's a social psychologist. He understands that, you know, human interaction is at the core of our well-being and achievement and so on and so forth. I'm not a psychologist, but I think I can understand Maslow pretty well. And like, when he talks about, like, you know, the importance of housing, well, of course, there is the physiological development, but there's also the psychological one, you know, the space of safety, and how when that is undermined, it kind of runs a thunderbolt through your life. You know, how do we do love and belonging? How do we do, you know, esteem and achievement? You know, even how we would even consider self-actualization when the things that are necessary for us to interact with the world and to achieve and to be happy and to so on and so forth are fundamentally undercut. You know, so hopefully your physiological needs are being met, but maybe your safety needs are not being met. You know, just to go home, close the door, I am home, that feeling that gives us the building block, the platform on which we propel ourselves out into the universe and go away and do great things. But when that is undermined, that's a significant piece. The other kind of thing I suppose we could speak to is from epidemiology. And we've been hearing a lot from epidemiologists in the context of COVID, right? All our health professionals from the World Health Organization and Irish government have been concerned with the impacts of COVID. But one of the things that the World Health Organization has been really focusing on is the social determinants of health. So how could we possibly explain how these relationship between stress and can undermine our health and well-being? Well, I think the social determinants can do that. Poor health cannot simply be explained by genes and germs alone. You know, it's much more complex. It involves the circumstances in which people live, their access to healthcare, to schools, to education, conditions of work, leisure, the quality of your home, your community, your towns and your cities, and the individual, the cultural characteristics, all the parts that make up our identity, and how these can empower us or disempower us in the way in which we can interact in the world. And obviously, what's key for you guys here is, you know, how, you know, the situation that you're in is undercutting the security of your home, but also, you know, your links to your community and the place that you are embedded within the world, where you've made your friends, where you play your football and where you do your drama society and all that kind of stuff. A lot of those things are under risk at the moment. All of these factors influence an individual's chance of leading a flourishing and healthy life. Chances for good health are not equally distributed across societies, and this can cause health inequalities. So where an identifiable proportion of the population are exposed to material want or stress, the impacts on health and well-being can be and have been measured. And to be honest, for the last decade before COVID, this was one of the major kind of research agendas within even the World Health Organization, which has really sought to focus on this link between when you put a proportion of the population under stress and anxiety, or put them into a situation of poverty or material wealth, how does that translate into their capacity to live well and also to flourish? So there have been some really good epidemiological studies done. There have been some done on the traveling community, which are really good. The applicability is perhaps not as obvious there. Maybe it is, but I haven't thought about it that much. But certainly this one here by the Combat Poverty Agency, tackling health inequalities, is something that I think could be useful to you guys. So at least since 2004, the World Health Organization has focused on this and other matters. In terms of the social conditions in which people live and work can help create or destroy their health. Poverty, food insecurity, social exclusion and discrimination, poor housing, unhealthy early childhood conditions, and low occupational status are important.
Lorcan, I'm going to have to get you to move on for the rest of the people, if that's okay.
You want me to finish?
Please.
Oh, what about my 5-minute warning?
This is it.
Oh, do I have 5 more minutes?
Well, maybe 3.
Okay. Let me flash along. Okay. Perhaps then this could be a useful way in which we could kind of understand this relationship between, you know, unwell living conditions. And it's the evidence base collected here by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, alongside Michael Marmouth. The 3 of them are probably some of the most important epidemiologists in the world. They measured the health outcomes across other comparable countries. Ireland is amongst them. So it's kind of OECD countries, countries who have a similar kind of political, economic kind of situation, a similar situation of economic and social development. And what they found is, as income inequality increases and you increase the exposure of that population to stress and anxiety, you get an absolute perfect trend line. For anyone here who does statistical analysis, that red line is a trend line. That's as perfect a trend line as you'll ever see in statistical analysis. As a significant proportion of the population is exposed to stress, anxiety, poverty, so on and so forth, life expectancy goes down, maths and literacy rates go down, infertility increases, and there's a whole series of social outcomes. So I will conclude then, Lisa, sorry, and I hope I have been somewhat useful, and I look forward to contributing to the panel discussion at the end. But if I was to say addressing these social determinants in isolation at an individual level, it's not feasible, as most causes appear to be outside the scope of any one individual. So what then? A collective response, only a collective response can and will be impactful. And there is a need for solidarity amongst you and your group, and for two key reasons. The first one is for advocacy purposes. Your current situation will most probably impact the health and well-being of all of you and your families, and understanding that and having a good empirical base to back up that. And perhaps, you know, a piece of research would be most welcome in terms of measuring the health and well-being of your community, but also to consolidate a supportive community which has the potential to moderate for feelings of isolation and loneliness. Final point, dealing with officialdom is itself a point of extreme stress if done alone. Collective action is a requirement for both well-being and also effective advocacy. Okay, hopefully that was some way useful. Sorry I over...
Thank you very much, Lorcan. I'm so sorry. I would have loved to let you keep going for ages, but we've other speakers, so I'm sorry for hurrying you.
No
that
problem.
Was sobering listening, some of the data that you've presented on the outcomes for people who live in housing insecurity. But I hope that people will take this as ammunition to add to their arguments in terms of why it is really important that this issue is resolved. So our next speaker today is Dr. Pascal Carmody. Pascal is a medical doctor who is living in a condemned home, and I'm hoping he'll turn on his microphone and camera so that we can see him and hear what he has to say. Pascal?
Okay, Lisa, if he doesn't respond, I think we go straight to Cyril, and I will call him in the background because I think he might be having technical issues.
Yeah,
okay.
Something. Yeah. So, Cyril, hi. Lovely to see you. Cyril is the CEO of a very lovely organisation called Let's Get Talking, who provide counselling and psychotherapy in various locations around Ireland. I'll let him talk about his own services himself, but he is also a psychotherapist by profession, and he's going to talk about the potential health impacts on people in this situation. So he'll be looking at things like anxiety and depression and so on. So I'd like to hand over to you, Cyril, and you're very welcome, and thank you for coming. You need to turn on your mic, Cyril. You're done.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I was a bit flustered there when I joined you because I'm afraid Lorcan has stolen an awful lot of my thunder in case of the research and the health effects of it. He's really been to the point. So in the research area and so on, I mean, and Maslow was my place of starting as well in terms of the hierarchy of needs and the absolute requirements for, you know, along with food, water, sleep, all of those things, obviously shelter and the security of that is absolutely vital. The other thing about homes, I guess, I to just put some context in what I can only imagine is the stress that people are feeling in this situation. You know, it's not just about individuals. And I very much concur with the whole idea that collective action is needed in terms of making a real contribution that permeates into people's mental health, as well as dealing with people on the individual level. And of course, ultimately, that's a political issue, which I'm not one of them. But I think I come at this, I suppose, from the point of view of a continuum, like an anxiety continuum, for example. And everybody, there isn't a one size fits all here for all of the people affected by this problem. You know, it's very much an individual thing in many cases, because some people are more tolerant, for example, of anxiety and outside stressors and environmental factors than others are. So it's quite a complicated issue. I believe that in terms of resolving the issue that we're here to support today, I do think that primarily it requires a group answer and ultimately a political answer. But in the meantime, we can't be just idealistic about that, because I don't honestly believe that collective action is #1 priority in the minds of the powers that be all of the time. So we have to deal with the fallout and deal with the circumstances and the impacts of the problem. One of the things that comes to mind as well is about the home situation. You know, it also shapes relationships and strengthens bonds between family members and so on. And ultimately, the whole idea of a home is a lifelong project. And the research does tell us that safe and secure housing is critical to our mental health, specifically, apart altogether from our physical health. But indeed, on top of that, the physical health is also impacted. So, like, pure quality housing, you know, is according to most of the research, that as a psychological stressor, it's very much a factor indeed in stress, anxiety, and indeed depression. And not to mention the fact that, and here's where individuals differ again, it exacerbates then existing intolerances to stressors and indeed mental health conditions as well. Not to mention the other area that's you know, really has a major impact on health is the whole idea of financial worries. And I'd say that most people, some of the way I'm going to get into that, what I propose to do is to talk a little bit about, in some detail, about some of the issues and some of the impacts in terms of the stresses, but also some of the things that can be done to help alleviate or improve the situation, bad and all as it is, or make it less severe, if you like. Like, one of the things that people often get into the habit of doing in situations that are very intolerable, where there's a lot of trauma and so on, is they become what they call what's called emotionally numb. So it's a survival mechanism which sort of in a way allows people to cope, but they become dead to the experience of life. And Lorcan mentioned all the things there, like milestones and all the things that people and families do, that's very much located in secure housing. I suppose the one thing that comes to mind with this problem for me is the psychological effects of ambiguity and uncertainty. I mean, sudden events which are sort of evolving, that quickly evolve, put people in a sort of a perpetual state of anxiety or of uncertainty. Like, things that deviate from our life plan, you know, can manifest then as a sense of being sort of out of control, because all of a sudden, this major life project, which is a family home in many cases, is just thrown into disarray. And in many respects, people feel out of control because, you know, sleeping in a house that's crumbling around you, I mean, what more do you need to create psychological stressors than that, in terms of just loss of sleep, irritability, fatigue, and generally being overwhelmed? I mean, the other thing that, I mean, although there's many different forms of anxiety, obviously panic attacks, you know, and this was also alluded to by Lorcan in terms of the physical effects. Like, you can cite physical chronic diseases, like the nervous system is under pressure all of the time in this situation. So you have chronic diseases. You also have in the autoimmune system is severely disturbed. Blood pressure, cardiovascular, all of that stuff exacerbates the problem. It's like a chicken and egg. Is it how I feel or how I am as a result of how I feel? And it just goes on and on and on. And this thing has been going on for a long time. I mean, the other thing is then, there's, in terms of anxiety then around this issue, you know, in many cases, as a psychotherapist, we would deal a lot with, if you like, irrational thinking, catastrophic thinking, jumping to conclusions that are, no, not tested in reality. But in this case, we can't say that to these people, because this is real. It's not a distortion of reality. So from that point of view, sort of, if you like, trying to distinguish and identify between what's a genuine fear and what isn't is quite difficult, and difficult is not measurable in the way that it normally would. You know, I mean, anxiety is a normal trait, is a normal thing that we have, and we need it. It's natural. We need it to survive. You know, otherwise we run out under a bus. But we don't have to be afraid going out on the road because we might meet a lion or something like that, if you know what I mean. Because when going back, I suppose we have adapted over the years, but not as fast as the world has changed. We don't, when we come out of the cave to go down to wash ourselves at the lake, there's not going to be a dinosaur around the corner that we have to check to see is he there. But in a way, severe anxiety can feel like that in terms of our response. When everything around us that was normal and we took for granted is just taken away from us, and there's the whole sense of loss. You know, depression then, of course, is another condition which is influenced to one degree or another by the environment or the interaction between the individual in terms of the individual's resilience and what's going on around them. You know, persistent sadness can be one of the conditions that suggests that sleep disruption, fatigue, lack of focus, lack of motivation, and up to and including thoughts of self-harm and suicidal ideation, depending on the individual circumstances again. So there are many sort of issues that mightn't be straight away apparent to people generally about the effects of this thing, but it's quite easy to imagine the lack of shelter or the lack of home or the prospect of it can be, you know, can generate. The thing I was saying about the continuum there, I suppose in terms of people trying to cope in this awful situation, there are a number of things, you know, I suppose all of us might be at 3 or 4 on the anxiety continuum, a lot of the time, but it's when it goes up to 5, 6, 7, and 8. So I would see the roles, for example, of a service like ours would be to help mitigate in some way the severity of the conditions that are caused by the situation that these people are in. Nothing more than that, but at least it's a place to start, you know. So one of the ways, there are a number of ways of, I suppose, trying to cope with this terrible situation. So one of the things that people could do is try and work out what has actually worked for them in the past in difficult situations. You know, the reality test then is what is actually uncertain, to be able to ascertain exactly what you have control of and what you don't have control of. You know, the purpose of that particular one is to try and limit the catastrophization somewhat, or the catastrophizing of the situation. And in general terms, it is catastrophic for many people, but at the same time, you know, there are things that you do have control of, and they can be worked on. You know, polarized thinking, which is very common. You know, like, for example, I can't protect my child from the distress of this, so I'm a bad parent. That all or nothing thinking, that's very, very common in those situations as well. And that can be helped. You know, building a structure in a day-to-day sense as well for people to build their own, some structure into their life. You know, the SMART principle, like, for example, you know, specific, measurable, that it's achievable. And, you know, that in some way you can make yourself accountable to yourself in a day that you live. And I'm coming on to the whole area, I suppose, one of the things that's often forgotten in people in dire situations is what is it that they have some gratitude for? Because, people, they don't sometimes think about all the good things that has happened in their life. So that's one of the areas. The other, I'll be quick. You know, living in the present moment is really what it's a lot about, because if we look so far into the future, we're inclined to catastrophize. We're inclined to make things, you know, absolutely unresolvable. And the big thing, I think, and one of the things that's very particular to this instance that we're discussing today is, and again, it's going on from what Lorcan spoke about, is connecting with people with shared experience. and having a group response to this and feeling that you're not alone. You're not alone. And obviously self-care, if it's possible, like yoga, mindfulness and so on, we all know that these things help a lot. So what I'm trying to just put forward is the possibility that while psychotherapy is not going to resolve this issue on its own, but it can make a contribution. And our service is available. It's an on-set fee service. So everybody in the community has access from the point of view that we straddle, if you like, public provision and private provision, in the sense that, you know, there isn't enough public provision and there never will be. And sometimes private provision is exorbitantly, distortionately expensive in many cases, and people can't get access. So our mission is to reduce barriers to access, and we'd be very glad to provide any assistance individually or group-wise to people afflicted by this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. And that's a very valuable and generous offer. I think hopefully what people have got from the first two presentations so far is that the things that they're experiencing, the anger, the rumination, the unrealistic thoughts about catastrophes and so on, are totally understandable and totally realistic. And if you're feeling that way, it's not you, it's the situation. And I think sometimes that can help people to at least accept that, okay, this is the way I'm feeling and it's reasonable, but it's just a feeling. But at the same time, if there is an opportunity for psychotherapy with Let's Get Talking, I would highly recommend that. I think that is a wonderful offer. So thank you very much. Hopefully people will come back to the self-care issue when we have the discussion at the end. But for now, I would like to introduce Dr. Pascal Carmody. Hi, Pascal. Thank you very much for coming. I might let you introduce yourself because I didn't get a chance to chat to you beforehand, if that's okay.
It's no problem. So I apologize. Michael Carmody is my own name. I'm Pascal's son. I'm also a doctor as well. Dad asked me just to do the presentation today, if that's okay. Now, during lockdown, I managed to avoid Zoom altogether, so I might not be technically the best at this. So if there are any issues, please let me know. So I was going to tell you a little bit about our story living in the house that was affected by block issues, and maybe some other relevant points that have to do with health afterwards. So my own background would be, I'm a general practitioner now, and I would have spent most of my training in emergency and some in occupational medicine, which would also involve exposure to certain chemicals and substances, medicine around that. So my parents built their house started building their house in 1989. Roadstone were the block suppliers. And the cracks started to begin to be noticed in the wall about 10 years later. I might be wrong with the timelines of this now, but shortly after that, my siblings would have noticed some upper airway symptoms. So chronic runny nose. My brother has asthma, so his asthma would worsen when he was in around the house. When he would leave the house for a period of time, it would go away. Since all the kids in the house have grown up and we've gone off to college or work, we would notice that when we come back to the house, fatigue would be an issue, tiredness would be an issue. So there's some of you might have seen already, I think a YouTube clip, the YouTube presentation that was made of a story of a house in Killaloe, where you'll see some of the images of the damage that's been done to the house so far. So big cracks in the wall, the roof has been replaced completely. Parts of the sides of the house are kind of falling down. My own bedroom, the roof is essentially kind of is almost off it now. My own bedroom is turning into a balcony. And I think what's become very apparent in the last 10 years, so this is kind of an issue that's gone on about 20, 25 years. What's become very apparent in the last 10 years is black mold that's penetrated in around the walls everywhere. And I'd imagine some people will be familiar with that. I was going to, if it's okay, I was going to talk a little bit about black mold because that might be an issue. Would that be okay? Okay, so so black mold, you'll be able to Google images for it, or you'll be able to see on the story of the house in Killaloe some images that would be very kind of classical black mold. if you are looking to research it, the Latin name for it would be Stachybotrys chartarum. So Stachybotrys and space Chartarum. So these are molds that can produce what are called mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are small molecules that can penetrate very deeply. They can penetrate through cell membranes as well, so they can infiltrate any tissue essentially. And what the black mold will usually do is it'll hitchhike its way into a home, either on an animal or on someone's clothing or on material, and it just thrives in wet conditions, watery conditions. And it'll usually kind of thrive in like drywall, plaster, paper, gypsum, anything that kind of that will absorb water. And the defective block is just a natural gateway for water to move into the materials of a house. So kind of just some symptoms that some people might be aware of, classical symptoms like upper airway irritation, wheezing, shortness of breath, sometimes nausea, low energy. But I might go through some of the other more subtle symptoms that can be associated with it. I should declare I'm not an expert in black mold. I guess I'm just someone who's kind of who would have kind of watched the experience of it going through as a family. And I have some medical background, so it might be helpful. So some of the kind of the other symptoms, but will be less spoken about or less available to find out in the literature, would be brain fog, memory problems, mood changes, mood swings, depression, difficulty concentrating, muscle aches. Sometimes people can have sensitivity to lights if they get recurrent sinus issues, recurrent vertigo, cravings for sugar, inability to regulate temperature, insomnia, tingling in the nerves, kind of at the ends of the hands or feet. Sometimes people can describe static shocks, digestive issues, rashes on the skin, reduced libido, and frequent infections. So there's some very vague symptoms. So if there is mold in someone's house and they want to be kind of fairly confident that this is not another issue, you'd want to make sure that the symptoms are lasting for a significant duration of time, so weeks, months, rather than a few days. There are some disease associations with black mold. So chronic inflammatory response syndrome would be the most common disease process that's adhered to black mold, or that's linked to black mold by the doctors who do get involved with it. That's kind of it's a generalized description of inflammation happening throughout the body. And when that's the case, when you have inflammation throughout the body, your symptoms can be, there can be quite a huge variety of symptoms that can present in that way. But the most kind of common symptom that will drive through all of that would be fatigue, low energy. The people who have asthma, which would be, as people who have asthma will be aware, it's a disease process that can be related to allergens. Asthma can be quite exacerbated by mold exposure. Anyone who has COPD, which would be in a similar vein of asthma, may notice that if they're in a house with black mold, that becomes significantly worse. People's immune system tends to function. Essentially, what the immune system has to do is fight against mycotoxin exposure over a period of time. That causes low energy, that causes the energy to drop off, and it causes people's immune system to be more vulnerable, or kind of causing a weaker immune system. Certain autoimmune conditions can be linked with mold exposure, like sarcoidosis. The way that it works is there's a big genetic component. So if anyone's doing their own research on this, they'll find there's a big genetic component of this. It's a thing called the HLA system, which is human leukocyte antigen system. So human being human, leukocyte is the white cells, part of your immune response, and the antigens are essentially what the immune system identifies as a problem or a threat, and then it goes and attacks. So people have different combinations of this HLA system, and depending on what genetic predisposition people have, they can get symptoms kind of more severely or less severely according to mold exposure and their genetic predisposition. when researching mold exposure, on a lot of, we'll say, websites that would be kind of more traditionally, I suppose more traditionally kind of just considered mainline, what they'll often kind of talk about, there's no evidence to support. And it's just significant if you're doing research into mold for yourself and for your family. No evidence to support doesn't mean evidence against. When as anyone kind of as experienced in academics will know, when a website has to publish regarding evidence, or has to make a statement regarding evidence, usually the websites will require a certain amount of evidence space before they'll dictate that something is scientifically factual. So there's likely just not enough data gathered yet on mold exposure around the world to imply that it's kind of certainly related to all these conditions. The mold kind of tends to work as well with other contaminants that can enter the house. So dust, things called endotoxins, which are produced by bacteria, which can also thrive in wet conditions and in wet materials, and beta-glucans, which are other byproducts of fungus as well. Mold being a fungus, I should have said at the start. So some links with damage to DNA, some very, very weak links with them being carcinogenic. The kind of proven that they'll reduce functions of neurotransmitters, meaning the hormones that help our brain function. That's where you get your brain fog and kind of mood swings, and then downstream changes in energy. They can impair mitochondria, which are building blocks, which are parts of the cell, which are involved in energy production. They'll suppress glutathione, which is an amino acid involved in aging process, immune process, energy levels in general. So I think it's relevant just with Cyril's talk. I think it's relevant because stress was mentioned, because you have two pathologies that are at play here. If someone does have mold in the house, you have the significant stress of dealing with the house that's quite damaged and crumbling around you, which chronic stress has a big impact on our ability to fight infection, our ability to maintain an efficient immune system. And then concomitantly have mold exposure alongside that. I believe myself it will the two risk factors that goes together are just going to exacerbate the condition overall. And then depending on someone's genetic susceptibility to mold exposure, the symptoms may be a little bit more intensive. So mold is you'll inhale mold or you'll ingest mold usually. So most likely if in a house it's kind of affected by black mold, it'll be inhaled in through spores. There will be some well-founded, maybe not so much in Ireland, but there will be well-founded class actions in legal cases from tenants against landlords where the black mold was in the buildings and where there's exposure that may be just relevant to look at. So that's just our story about. For ourselves, my brother, he does get exacerbations of his asthma when he comes back to the house. He has those kind of relatively well controlled. The fatigue is still an issue, but we haven't been able to shift the mold out of the house because of the issues that everyone else is facing where the block can't be replaced.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. It's really interesting to hear of the physical kind of repercussions of this in terms of additional issues that are arising, but also I was quite interested in the way that the symptoms overlap. So things like muscle pain and headaches would go with stress as well as with the physical outcomes. So it must be very confusing for people to be experiencing all of these things, or some of them at least. But thank you very much for talking to us. What I'd like to do now is encourage people to answer any question or ask any questions or make any comments in relation to the panel. You can either use the chat box. I see we have a couple in the chat box already, or you can use the Q&A box along the bottom, whichever you prefer. But what I was going to do now was go to the comments that we have so far. So Seamus May had said, that's a great presentation from Lorcan and Cyril. You hadn't been on at that point, Stephen. It's precisely why all victims must be paid damages as well as full remediation costs. And then Mary Connors is saying, once a bill is in place, we need to push for a national study on the effects of defective blocks on families and long-term health and mental health. Thank you for this wonderful seminar. And we have a query here about, is this legislation proposed? So I might throw that back to the panel now shortly in case anybody is able to answer that. Seamus is saying that the proposed legislation is a catastrophe. It'll go nowhere near meeting victims' remedial rebuilding costs. It'll discriminate against the huge numbers of victims whose property is not the primary home, and the proposed legislation doesn't have the support of the majority of victims across several counties. It's an affront to the public interest, including victims and taxpayers. So I might just open that up to our panel now to maybe offer their reflections on those comments and see where we go from there.
Hi, Lisa. Perhaps the comments on the legislation, there, like, we don't have, that came up yesterday, there's no pre-legislative scrutiny, or we are very much worried about that, because these issues that we're raising, particularly access, and I think it was very quite obvious yesterday from the engineering panel, and particularly comments around, you know, it's almost like they're going to keep certain homes that they don't deem at a certain level of damage waiting for years and years, potentially decades, before they gain access. So they're living in decades of ongoing stress as the home deteriorates, and prolonged uncertainty, that state that Cyril was speaking about. Really, it's a constant state of alarm, and it impacts every single part of your daily life, your psychology, and obviously now as well. I mean, I have black mold beginning in my house, and from the surveys I've conducted with homeowners, it seems to be creeping into quite a number of them.
Thank you. Anybody else, any comments on this?
Just a thought came to mind. I'm not aware of the legislation, so I'm sorry I can't comment on that. But there was something that did come to my mind today, and maybe yesterday when I was thinking about this. I suppose I'm somebody who's been involved with, you know, advocating for the rights of homeless people for a long time. And one of the major issues we have is that people are not really generally sympathetic towards the rights of homeless people. I'm not saying everybody, but there's often, even this comes from policymakers, a kind of idea of, you know, there's somehow guilt, or there's something that they've done themselves that's led them into that situation. Okay, now we could talk about that till the cows come home. There's a stigma around homelessness, and I'm not saying this equates exactly with that, but you as a group are in a completely different situation. And like, I know anytime I've ever spoken to anyone about this conference or anything, the outpouring of, you know, empathy is there in a way that's not there with other groups that I've tried to advocate for. You know, the tenure system in Ireland is a bit of a mess. Well, it's a disaster. It's in crisis, you know. But as a group, this group, you've followed the ideal, you know, of what it is we ought to do if we're in a position to do it, which is purchase your own home, build your own home, so on and so forth. So I think when everybody hears about it, there is almost universal empathy, because lots of the vast majority of most other people, and certainly people who are in influential positions within society, could really empathize with your situation. And that gives you power that other groups don't have, particularly in terms of collective action. So whatever is the outcome for this, and I saw somebody saying that there should be some research done in terms of the health impacts. That's something that should be done now, you know. And I know part of one of the outcomes, or hopeful outcomes from this, is that you would, you know, write up, you know, your situation and have you know, a definitive kind of ambitions and statements and an analysis of the situation. And I think that's really important. Of course, Cyril said it, he hit the nail on the head there, in terms of you need it for your own health and well-being, you know, but you also, you know, need to have material gains here, you know. And I think you're pushing an open door in terms of trying to win the support of the general public in a way that other groups aren't. So I don't know if that's useful.
Yeah, thank you, Lorcan. Mary.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Well, first of all, congratulations to all of the speakers this afternoon. It was a fabulous, a very enlightening discussion. I suppose it's the word I'm going to use. Lorcan mentioned the deep levels of stress dealing with officialdom. I can tell you that is one of the biggest stresses we have as a group of homeowners who have defective concrete blocks. And you also we were talking about Maslow's, the hierarchy of needs and all of that. I think Lorcan used it, go home and close the door and relax. Well, Lorcan, a lot of us now in Clare, and I'm sure the same in Mayo and Donegal, I go home and I close the door, but it's impossible to close the door now for the last couple of weeks because the blocks are moving again. So it actually is something we'd all love to be able to do, is go home and close the door and relax. But it's one of the biggest issues we have now is that the vast majority of people, and I know I could say nearly 1,000 people now in Clare who have this issue. And the reality is we can't go home to relax because all we see is cracks and mold. And I have black mold as well in the house. And I suppose it's something that people like Lorcan and Cyril and Michael there, you know more about the effect it has on mental health. And you obviously, Lisa, as a psychologist, you're aware of the effects it can have on people. And unfortunately, only people like Martina and myself and maybe Josephine there, a few other people are willing to say it. So many people are suffering in silence. And number one, are embarrassed about their houses. They haven't even registered maybe with the Pirate Action Group, which is a shame, because it's the only place together as a group. If we work as a group, that's where the solidarity comes. And it also helps each of us to maybe unwind a bit when we can speak to each other. But it's one of the biggest issues we have really, Lisa and Lorcan and Cyril, is getting members and non-members of the group to actually open up and tell us how they feel or speak to somebody about how they feel. And I think this afternoon session from that point of view has been fantastic. And the fact that Martina is recording it and will do something on it is going to be of great value to the members and to the non-members of the Pirate Action Groups in both counties and all three counties. So I just want to say thanks a million, but unfortunately we can't close our doors in some of our houses anymore. They don't work properly anymore, Lorcan.
So I'm so sorry to hear that, Mary. And I just something came into my head and I wanted to say it before I forget. There's one other group who I think would be comparable to you. And this is, remember when Board Snip Nua came in and they said, we're going to get rid of the over 70s medical card. There was some issue that was really affecting older persons. And what they did, 10,000 people descended on Dáil Éireann and they were queuing up. People who had been sitting on the fence, they were queuing up to get up on the podium and to say how they were going to support that issue. Now, I think you will find a very similar level of solidarity if you were to do that kind of collective action piece, of literally going there and visibly showing your numbers and putting pressure on politicians and having people address the particularities of the issue. Doing it collectively could have a transformative impact on any upcoming legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I take your point, Lorcan, and that's what I'd expect. But, the empathy from the people, Lorcan, I have to say that some of the politicians have been very effective with the way they have brought the public against us, the taxpayers. Oh, after all, this is taxpayers' money. Where is it going to come from? How are we going to pay for the damage? Well, we all have answers, but some of the politicians have been very quick to talk about taxpayers' money, Lorcan, and they have actually turned quite a few people against us.
Yeah, I just say as well, going back to the 15th of June and Paddy Deaver's campaign and the 100% redress, that there were 20,000 people on the streets between the 15th of June and the 8th of October in front of the Dáil. And we were there on the 15th of June, standing beside Donegal and Mayo, and we listened to every single politician come down and promise the world. And they all voted that night or the night later for 100% redress. And here we are a year later, nearly to the day, and not a single thing has been done. They're leaving people in desperate states for now over a decade.
It's so demoralizing. And I just want to pick up on what Mary said about people not acknowledging mental health problems. And I almost think I'm chair of Limerick Mental Health Association, so I might be in a little bubble where we do a lot of campaigns talking about it's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to say that. But it seems to me like that there needs to be a much more focus on, because of what it does to your body when you're dealing with this, when you can't relax in your own home, when you're ruminating and you're finding that people aren't supporting you the way you want them to. And I'm just wondering, Cyril, you mentioned some self-care mechanisms or issues. Is there anything more you'd like to say about that? With your microphone on.
I think, again, you know, I suppose particularly in the light of COVID, and there's been it's become very topical now to talk about mental health as well, you know. And there's a lot of, well, what I call them sort of new mental health gurus now who are radio jockeys and things like that, and they're all on about it, you know. I suppose there's two ways of going about it. I mean, there is self-help that you can do yourself, you know, in terms of things like yoga, things like mindfulness, and the whole, that's particularly helpful in not projecting too far into the future and all the worry and ruminating and all of that type of stuff. But I mean, I happen to believe, hence what I do, I think that everybody should have a therapist, irrespective of MICA or, you know, whether you come from Ukraine or whether you're, you know, having a perfectly normal, rewarding life, because it's not all about people with something wrong with them, mental health. Mental health is more to do with, it has a preventative role, and that has never really happened with mental health like it has with physical health. I mean, even you bring your car for an NCT test, you go and you get your bloods, you go into the doctor and you get your bloods done once a year or whatever else. So I think it should become, and it is indeed becoming more common for particularly young people to get involved with, you know, personal development, all that type of stuff. So I would say myself, mindfulness is very good and can be done on your own. It's a help if you can get a professional to maybe get you in on it and do it and so on. There's lots of apps available online in terms of all of that. But ultimately, I think the magnitude of this crisis for people, and as Mary said, you know, people are reluctant, you know, for one reason or another, particularly people, maybe middle-aged people and upwards and so on, there is still quite a stigma, you know. Like if they see me going into a counselling centre, they'll be saying, she's bad with her nerves, you know. That's the kind of feeling that's there on certain age groups, but it is getting better. But I think, you know, you could encourage your members to deal with that aspect, because it's the one thing that's always left until last, you know. Yeah. And even 6-8 sessions just to get maybe a different perspective or a new perspective on how they're actually learning to cope with the way their life is. And I did mention as well that before MICA or any of this, people had psychological stressors, and they're exacerbated now because of this. But you know, they could also provide the catalyst for people to have more fulfilling lives.
Yeah. So going back to what you were saying, Cyril, I work with social care students, and lots of them go for counselling when they're students. And the reason is because they're going to be dealing with huge amounts of emotional issues, and they need to get in training. It's like running a marathon. You need to get emotionally fit in order to deal with difficult emotional circumstances. So I think for people in this situation, you're already in an emotionally fraught situation. So
Yeah.
if there's a way you can avail of counselling and psychotherapy, I would 100% agree with that. I think that is, you know, it's so helpful. It is, yeah.
And
It's
the thing
best, really.
with Let's Get Talking, for example, and I'm not here to
Yeah.
advertise our service, but what I am saying to you is we do both online as well, which may suit people that are not in suitable places to go somewhere else, or to do face-to-face, we do online. And also, as I did mention, it's about people pay what they can afford as a fee. It's not low cost, it's not anything. People pay what they can afford. So we'd be glad to welcome any of those people who feel that just, you know, support sessions even.
Yeah.
Would, if they, you know, we'd welcome that.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Cyril.
Yes,
Josephine, did you put your hand up?
Yes, geez, Lisa. No, just listening to you there has been so enlightening, really. It has been just phenomenal, and it has been really, really informative. I just want to come back to a few things that panelists were saying there, and the point that Mary made, that you can close your door. We found the very same thing here in Mayo, Mary, when we started the action group first, all right? People were very afraid to come forward and to put their name down you know, on the register, for the simple reason, I think, that they associated the word pyrite with the word cancer. And they were overwhelmed, really and truly, by its presence in the blocks that they used to build their homes and their houses. And very, very frightened by the way it was causing the walls of their homes to crack and crumble before their very eyes. All right. We started in 2012, you can say, and we have had a lot of people have lost their health, physical and mental health. Two of our founding members, if you like, we have lost one of them earlier this year, and Dorothy, who has been by my side all the way through this. Her husband has vascular dementia. He doesn't know that his house has to be knocked. He had one leg amputated there about 3 weeks ago, and the other one now is causing him trouble. He's in full-time care. Dorothy cannot close the door on her front door. So if she goes out of her house, she has to lock the back door. She has to lock the front door from inside, and she has to go out the back door. All right. She kept Tom at home for a good while. We did everything that we possibly could to get different resources and supports for her. The HSE wouldn't put in a wheelchair ramp, so the community had to help her do that because the blocks weren't safe. The current scheme, you talked about that, and Pascal said it about the blocks. You cannot knock. You have to knock the house. Okay. I've had trouble with the foundation from the very beginning. The current scheme, as it stands, all right, we welcomed it, I suppose, and we tried it. It didn't work because the terms and conditions were so prohibitive, really and truly, that they effectively blocked us from accessing it, all right? And then when we got on to the application process, the bureaucracy of the paperwork involved in getting the provisions required was just appalling, really. The regulations are very, very extreme and harsh. And then the other thing is, when you get your letter of eligibility and you can go ahead and start remediating your house, the foundations are uncovered. And your engineer will tell you, look, we don't know what is there until the house is demolished and the site is cleared. And that's costing us about 30,000, you know, to go through the various proper channels, knock our house, pay for it all. We also have to pay for the test. So we get so far, we get past stage one, we cannot go any further. And this new scheme that's coming down the road is just a joke, really and truly. It's just kicking the can down the road. We'll never get our houses fixed. I really do not think we ever will. People are just, frustration isn't the word, really and truly. They're despondent, they're depressed. An awful lot of them have given up hope. And as you said yesterday, Mary, they're at an age now where we have members on the register here, and they just thank us for everything we do, and they just say, you know, I'm not going to be around, you know, to see this. Their houses are falling down. Then there's the health hazards of it, and we have to listen. We have to deal with all of this. And then on our local radio station here, there's an ad put out by the suppliers. One of our quarry is the quarry here in Mayo that I'm talking about. There's no point in saying otherwise. They have an ad now. They don't do concrete blocks anymore because the fallout of defective blocks that have been sourced there are just appalling, really, and there's thousands of houses affected in Mayo. They have an ad on the radio now. They're tarmacading, doing tarmacadam, and the ad is on the radio constantly. And you talk about the mental effect that's having on homeowners. I cannot tell you how it just gets to people. The last line is it in the ad is, do it right the first time.
Oh, that's infuriating.
Now, I have told the minister
enraged,
about that.
yeah.
I met him and I told him about that.
Yeah.
You know, and we have gone to the station, Lisa, umpteen times. My husband has been on the phone to them. Please take it off. It is driving people insane.
Yeah, no, that's such an insult. And I see here people saying, you know, politicians have betrayed victims. There's people talking about how stressed homeowners are and they've done everything right and worked really hard. I can't read them all out in full, but I do want to honor what people are saying, that, you know, these are real and heart-wrenching issues that people are dealing with. It really is awful for people. I'm so sorry. Cyril, were you going to say something? I might give the last word to you and then hand back to Martina.
Well, it's just, it's been very informative. I've obviously been very interested in the issue since it started. But I mean, to actually get involved with people and talk about it, and the fact that you asked me here encouraged me to investigate it a little bit more. And I feel huge empathy for people in this situation, because I know what it's like in a house, you know, what it's like without one as well, by the way. That happened to me as well.
Yeah, the meaning of home is so crucial to people.
Yeah.
So I want to hand over to Dr. Cleary just to close out the conference, but I also want to thank her very much for running it, for soldiering on when I know there's a lot going on for you personally, and for doing such a wonderful job and for inviting us all here. So Martina.
Thank you so much. I think this was incredible panel as well, and I would just say it's the action groups that are on the ground. Josephine was the first person I spoke to as when I discovered it. If it wasn't for Josephine, I don't know where I would have been, you know. But the impact on us as human beings is immense. You know, Josephine's already lost a dear friend to it because of it. That's why they've gone. So we need resources here on the ground. You know, I know Donegal are a little bit further down the line with community resilience and finding funds to set up community resources that can work around these issues of mental health, and building in resilience training workshops and days and these types of things. And it is shocking that it is up to the impacted homeowners who are living under the duress of these homes that we have to self-organize to not only cope with living in our houses and organizing these kind of fantastic events, you know, but it's left on us. We're the victims of it. We're fighting. We're politically lobbying. We're having to go through this horrendous bureaucracy, which is deliberately made to destroy us further and delay and make sure to eliminate as many of us as possible. And then we have to build. But I suppose if that's the game that's being played, well, let's band together. let's build the solidarity here, because the more voices and the more expertise. I think what's been brilliant about this conference is the different fields that are beginning to open up and understand what is happening here. And the issue of, was Lorcan saying, like empathy. Yes, there is a degree of empathy, but there's also going to be a degree of panic, because this is, you know, we're talking about 5,000-6,000 houses in Donegal. We're talking about 4,000 at least, Josephine, in Mayo. We know of 1,000. That's only a fraction of what's coming out. There was the front of the Examiner. Limerick is going to be even worse. It's in Tipperary, it's in North Cork, Wexford, Wicklow, Carlow, Dublin, Offaly. There's nothing like having your own cow in the ditch to make you stand up and start fighting. So if you're not going to realize that it's your own house or that of your friends, family, grandmother, aunt, sister, cousin that's going to be impacted here. And I would say as well, like this issue of black mold. Black mold, as my understanding from the medical expertise I've been speaking to, black mold is contagious. It kind of moves from house to house. So unfortunately, like this attitude that it doesn't affect me, I'm grand. Well, actually it will, because the impacts that are coming out, not only the mental, but the physical, and we do need more research in that. So I want to sincerely thank every single person that's contributed to this, you know, and all of the voices. We will be going through all of this material afterwards and unpacking it when I have a little bit more time. And yeah, I'm kind of hoping from our own institute that we will get more research on it from the different departments, more students, and definitely more conversations coming in, interinstitutional as well. Mary, would you like to say something?
Thanks, Martina. Well, first of all, I would like to thank TUS for facilitating this international conference, and the contributions that all of you from TUS have made to the conference and all the other speakers has been incalculable. It has been just fantastic. And I want to say a special thank you to TUS. We are blessed to have such a university so close to us. And I feel that we can call on people like Lisa and Lorcan in the future, because people like you, you're the experts in your field. And anytime that we feel we need extra help, I'm sure you'll be willing to support us in any way you can, like you have done today. And a very, very special thanks to Martina for organising the conference, because Martina has been the driving force in Clare, and she's the one who got in touch with Mayo and got in touch, set up the whole thing for us here in Clare. And as usual, when Martina does something, she does it to the highest standard. And I just want to say thank you, Martina, and we do appreciate all you do, and we wish you well in our campaign ahead, because I think we have a long, long road and long battle ahead of us. But I certainly want to say a very sincere thank you to Martina, and we know you're going through a tough time.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'll sign out now and see you all again soon, hopefully. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody. Mind yourself.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.